Greetings. My name is Wendy Lynne. I am a professor at Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania. I'm delighted to be able to share some of my current work with you. This paper is part of a book that I hope to be publishing next year, whose title is The Commodification of Sentience. And today, the paper that I would like to share with you is titled The Commodification of Sentience, Non-Human Animals, and the Disarticulation of Value. All right, I'm going to get going. In a book entitled Extinction, A Radical History, author Ashley Dawson argues that capitalism is not necessarily more immoral than previous social systems with regard to cruelty to animals and the gratuitous destruction of nature. As a mode of production and a social system, however, capitalism requires people to be destructive of the environment, unquote. Dawson names three destructive aspects of the capitalist system that he regards as particularly relevant to the current epoch, as Elizabeth Kolbert might put it, of the sixth extinction. One, capitalism tends to degrade the conditions of its own production. Two, it must expand ceaselessly in order to survive. Three, it generates a chaotic world system, which in turn intensifies the extinction crisis. Dawson's succinct account, I think, is dead on as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. Indeed, what it doesn't capture is the fact that given that the survival of any competitive capitalist enterprise depends on its uncompromising adherence to what I call a logic of commodification, even degrades must itself be understood to create new opportunities for profit. Degraded must be able to be invested with exchange value. Dawson's certainly right that capitalism generates a chaotic world system, but this system is more than merely frenzied and muddled. Such a system, I argue, is inherently nihilistic, because the logic by which it operates results not merely in degrading the conditions of its own reproduction, but in ignoring, concealing, and denying what it exhausts, pollutes, and cannot replace, while at the same time it commodifies the crises and the chaos it creates to provide new opportunities and new markets. My contention then is that extinction intersects with capitalism in ways that exceed the loss of species, ways that expand and transform the meaning of loss in virtue of a logic of commodification that creates a world system destined not only for self-defeat, but predictable self-destruction. Defeat can be explained in terms of excess, but self-destruction demands a deeper interrogation into the conceptual origins and character of the logic itself. The logic of commodification doesn't, in fact, produce a chaotic world system. It produces a nihilistic one for which the appearance or even the experience of chaos provides cover and opportunity, whose driving mode of operation is, in fact, as simple as it is psychopathological: profit at any cost. Put differently, while there's little doubt that the history of extinction provides a vital barometer of capitalist excess, it doesn't explain in what the original sin, the prime propellant, consists, the radical, R-A-D-I-C-L-E, that anchors the logic of commodification so deeply woven into the ligature of human agency and institution and culture and tradition, that despite its capacity for apocalyptic self-destruction, it feels as natural to us as breathing. Dawson argues that capital remorselessly breaks down the complex natural world into impoverished but exchangeable forms, and that this becomes particularly starkly evident when seen through the lens of extinction. He then offers a really grisly example of the American fur trade to illustrate the intimate relationship between the creation of a bottomless demand for animal skins, the species extinctions or near extinctions that follow, and the decimating effect that the growth of the fur trade had on the indigenous peoples of the Americas. But what he doesn't explore, or stipulates only obliquely, is the fateful conceptual point at which capitalist expansionism crosses its Rubicon, the indispensable idea that charts the course for a logic whose predictable outcome is irrecoverable ecological destruction, the climate crisis, human and non-human suffering, and of course, extinction. The critical idea is not, I argue, at least in the first place, that inherent to capitalism is the necessity that quite literally everything be potentially commodifiable, extractable, or disposable, even though this is true. It's not that living demands no special consideration from the capitalist before becoming subject to the logic of commodification. The crucial idea is that the capacity for sentience poses no obstacle or prohibition to commodification, and hence that the capacity for suffering need not feature in the calculation for disarticulating all value into exchange value, including that of animal bodies, human bodies, bodies of land, bodies of water, embodied communities or cultures, or body politics. In short, where sentience is no bar to commodification, living carries no weight at all. For while it might be true that only living things with the capacity can be things with the capacity to experience suffering, once sentience is vacated of its moral relevance, whether a thing is living is unlikely to arise as worthy of moral consideration. If the capacity for pain doesn't matter, why would its underlying condition matter, other than to questions of its renewability as a resource, whether it poses an obstacle that might need to be neutralized? We engineer cows, pigs, chickens, disarticulate them inside slaughterhouses, meatpacking plants, and consume their depersonalized body parts largely, though willfully oblivious to the facts of their misery or their short lives inside of factory farms. But while ensuring supply to demand occupies the attention of meat industry CEOs, the incalculable suffering of animals whose dismemberment, like debeaking, often begins before their lives have even ended, does not warrant concern, much less a reconsideration of a business model. In short, living is no bar to commodification because sentience is no bar. Capitalism is not rightly described as nihilistic because what a successful enterprise disarticulates first is the animal, but because what it disarticulates first is the value of sentience itself. The dismemberment of bodies merely materializes the assignment of exchange value. Whether the animal in process of being dismembered is alive or conscious or terrified or suffering has no calculable weight at all. There can be no judgment of a capitalism that is excessive, right? That's what follows, I think. Excess presupposes limits that can be exceeded. But having vanquished the value of sentience, the logic of commodification has no limits. Its product simply is the materialization of what is inherent to its character. I think we rightly call this kleptocracy. That is, profit by any means necessary, including theft. We rightly call this theft insofar as it presupposes what the planet cannot sustain: endless resources. But what we experience as plunder from the point of view of the logic is simply the sound of value disarticulated, rearranged, and repackaged as product. Capitalism is theft. The chaotic world is kleptocracy. Here's an example. Until fairly recently, few have considered in any sustained way the morality of wet markets. That is, markets, among other things, that sell live animals, wild and domesticated, that provide subsistence livelihood to some small farmers, and that form a part of a cultural and tradition of many cultures in many countries. My aim is China. While animal rights defenders have sought on occasion to bring attention, for example, to the cruelty of the Chinese dog meat trade, it's actually been the advent of SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, and its impacts on human health that has elicited international condemnation, even against a backdrop of accusations of cultural imperialism and hypocrisy. Yet, as Matthew Scully writes for National Review, when cultural tradition collides with market forces in the midst of global pandemic, there the issues become far more complex. Quoting him, already in the Western media, chronologies of the pandemic have taken to passing over details of the live animal markets, which have caused viral outbreaks before and would all warrant some judgment in any case. News coverage picks up the story with the Chinese government's cover-up of early coronavirus cases and its silencing of the heroic Wuhan doctors and nurses who tried to warn us. To brush past the live markets in fear of seeming xenophobic or racist or unduly judgmental of other people in other ways is, however, to lose sight of perhaps the most crucial fact of all, he writes. Quote, we don't know the endpoint of this catastrophe, but we're pretty certain that its precise point of origin was what Dr. Fauci calls that unusual human-animal interface of the live markets, which he says should be shut down immediately, presumably including the markets quietly tolerated in our own country. In other words, the plague began, right, and I think the language here is important, with savage cruelty to animals, unquote. What has changed, in other words, is not merely the advent of COVID-19 and the prospect of its zoonotic transmission from non-human animals to human beings, but that whatever the issues concerning judgments of cultural imperialism, the threat posed by asymptomatic spread takes priority precisely because the endpoint of the catastrophe is existential for us. As Scully might agree, however, endpoint is a relative term. After all, it can just as well describe savage cruelty as it can the human body count from coronavirus. But as Scully also observes, although the plague began with savage cruelty to animals, we only seem to become courageous enough to brave the criticism that condemning wet markets is racist or xenophobic when we can safely shift the focus from the savagery to non-human animals to the prospect of a global pandemic that sickens and sometimes kills human beings. This point is well taken from Scully. Yet while he's certainly right to point out the hypocrisy in condemning Chinese wet markets, while we ignore the absolute misery that characterizes American factory farms, the conclusion he draws that plagues have a way of prompting us to take stock of our lives, remember what really matters, that strikes me actually as tepid. Whatever really matters is far more, I think, than mere personal stock taking. Indeed, as the evidence of the quick return to the wet market shows, leaving that remembering to individual consumers whose traditions are not only co-opted by capitalism, but exploited as an excuse to maintain the commodification of sentience, is not likely to reduce the quotient of suffering for human or non-human beings. In short, there are deeper questions that we must ask if we're going to understand not only how we got to COVID-19, but what in our relationship to non-human sentient life and the ecologies we share in increasingly close quarters is in fact how it became so savage, it returns to haunt us in the form of pandemic outbreak. Scully again offers a clue, quote, we in the West don't eat pangolins, turtles, civets, peacocks, monkeys, horses, foxes, or wolf cubs. That's all a plus. But for the animals we do eat, we have sprawling, toxic, industrial mass confinement farms that look like concentration camps. national herds and flocks that would all expire in their misery, but for a massive use of antibiotics, among other things, to maintain their existence amid squalor and disease. An infectious time bomb closer to home as bacterial and viral pathogens gain in resistance. And a whole array of other standard practices like the intensive confinement of pigs in gestation cages, the bulldozing of lame downer cows, the maceration of unwanted chicks are routinely tossed into grinders, all of which leave us very badly compromised as a model of the decent treatment of animals, unquote. I think Scully's dead on right here, that we're very badly compromised with respect to our recognition that the treatment of non-human animals in Chinese wet markets is deplorable, even as we deploy less violent sounding euphemisms like intensive confinements or maceration as part of a strategy to ignore and deny horrific practices like bulldozing downer cows. But that it should take a global pandemic that threatens human life to get our attention, even as we continue this hypocrisy, raises precisely the question that Scully does not address. What beyond the obvious savagery do these markets have in common? Scully does offer a clue, quote, in general, he writes, we keep the sadness and desperation of those creatures as deeply suppressed from conscious thought as possible. An etiquette of denial pushes the subject away, leaving it all for others to bear. Indeed, but what Scully misses, I think, right, or sort of glosses over, is that insofar as this etiquette of denial very often comes cloaked in the appeal to cultural tradition, it functions not merely to push the subject or the subjugated away, it makes of it an affront to question whether the savagery is justified. It's impolite, imperialist to query whether an appeal to tradition or culture suffices to justify barbarism. We think it's impolite, disrespectful to ask someone standing in a grocery line with their packages of hamburger why they haven't gone vegan. So gaping, in other words, is the psychic distance between the fact of savagery and the possibility of moral outrage at the conditions that produce it, that an appeal to little more than a caricature of tradition or etiquette is sufficient to push the subjugated away. That is the genius of the logic of commodification. Its capacity to operationalize those aspects, however significant or trivial, of cultural tradition that are expedient to it as an instantiation of exchange value or a marketing gimmick, but always a revenue generator. The product of the wet market is not merely the pangolin, the turtle, the wolf cub slaughtered and taken home for dinner, but the image, the simulacra of cultural tradition that, albeit debauched, co-opted, and caricatured, is represented as respected and preserved, such that only the ill-mannered or boorish would question its significance. The ill-mannered thus becomes a dismissible object of righteous indignation. It can be ignored, denied, even scorned, as if a violation of etiquette, respecting a tradition, is a worse thing than the savagery meted out in its name. Or, put differently, irony is a savagery hidden behind an etiquette evinced in the name of tradition, itself expropriated in the service of capital, but clothed in the language of ought or respect or how dare you. This too is the genius of the logic of commodification. That indignation can be exploited in the service of consumption, made all the more effective by the righteous appeal to, my God, it's food. That we ought to respect tradition at the cost of barbarity, executed in the service of profit, is the epitome not only of human chauvinism, but of the world system that it mirrors, capitalism as kleptocracy. For like its analog in the factory farm, the disarticulated product of the wet market is neither tradition nor culture, but a caricature of tradition and culture embodied literally and figuratively in the butchered bodies of pangolins or the carcasses of bludgeoned turtles or the cows at the factory farm. Even the idea that tradition can be divorced from the capitalist forces that exploit it makes sense only as a marketing pitch, as a product whose credibility as culture or tradition are advertised as exempt from their caricatures displayed on billboards, TV ads, travel brochures. To be very clear, this is not to say that there's no such thing as culture or tradition, nor is this to suggest that culture and tradition play no active and important role in the life of a country. But it is to say that insofar as economic development is driven by the logic of commodification, culture and tradition are as liable to the forces of conversion to exchange value as are the creatures sold at wet markets, subject to the disarticulation of their bodies, repackaged for consumption as food. Whether this assignment of value as food is tradition is largely irrelevant. The pangolin now counts as food because it's marketable as food. The turtle now counts as food because it can command a price as food. Once more, the rule of capital is neither chaotic nor is it excessive. It is simply the machination of the logic of commodification, grinding out product. If accusations of imperialism can be converted to a strategy for protecting the commercial value of tradition or culture as product, that is what we see, and it is what we eat. That culture and tradition can be commandeered as a justification for savagery and for ignoring the fact of savagery to profitable effect when it's packaged as food foreshadows what I call the kleptocene, the age of unregulated resource theft. Having preempted the value of sentience as an obstacle, the logic of commodification is a logic of regulated resource theft, only insofar as regulation or apparent regulation serves its interests. Wherever that's not the case, as in resource scarcity or the opportunity presents itself to exploit a crisis, like a viral outbreak, the logic's meaning is disclosed to us. Profit by any means necessary. The kleptocene signifies what is intrinsic to the logic made manifest by conditions that expose its mercenary nature. For example, a defense of wet markets by appeal to cultural or tradition, regardless the toxic intersection between the geopolitical location of the markets and the global economy, the fact of zoonotic transmission, or the lethality of a novel virus. Consider one more example. Christos Linteris Lyle Fernley's argument for why shutting down Chinese wet markets would be a terrible mistake. Certainly, these writers have a point when they argue that that Western media reports concerning Chinese wet markets very often depends on images that, quote, communicate a sense of disgust toward the eating habits of the Chinese, at the same time reflect the fear of the interconnectedness of two types of emergence in China, viral and economic, and that, quote, wet markets are portrayed as emblems of Chinese otherness, chaotic versions of Oriental bazaars, lawless areas where animals that should not be eaten are sold as food, and where what should not be mingled comes together. This fuels, they continue, xenophobia and anxieties of what anthropologists have long identified as, quote, matter out of place, a symbolic system of pollution through which proscriptions and prescriptions of what foods may be combined, right, is held up as a mirror, unquote. Linteris and Fernley are right that the expectation that China will conform to Western models of economic development out of a desire to mimic Western ideals or out of economic vulnerability, they're right that that's little more than just xenophobic prejudice tinged with the fear that China will do no such thing. They're right to point out that there's no one kind of wet market, and that assessing the risks posed to human health must be accompanied by a better understanding of the differences between them. Wet markets, they argue, have provided important livelihoods to independent small farmers, especially given the history of the agricultural producers cooperatives introduced in the 1950s by Mao Zedong. Right, the post-Mao market reforms that followed that, and the second leap that sought to greatly expand food production by building heavily capitalized supply chains, often centered in fact on slaughterhouses and processing facilities, very much like the West. But like Scully, what Lynteris and Ferlin miss is the narrative against which they seek to defend small-scale farmers and farming traditions in China. This is the story of the expropriation of the very traditions in the interest of the country's capacity to compete in global markets. The history of the post-Mao market reforms is not, other than as window dressing, the history of a return to respect for small farmer traditions. It's the history of a culture commodified in a fashion most conducive to ensuring the operations of capital under changing geopolitical and economic conditions. The preservation of wet markets does not have as its first objective food, but rather the simulacrum of the tradition of food that can be exploited to sell non-human animals as food. Maintaining the wet markets preserves the social order that helps to ensure a steady reserve of labor, thereby helping to prevent disruption in the flow of goods and services, even in the face of crises like viral outbreaks. Lynteris and Fernley actually hint at this when they say that anthropologists have discussed in some detail how the Chinese model of development has been perceived in the West as a threat, politically and culturally, to China's economic development because of its rapid nature and the competition this might pose to the EU or US economies. And it's a cultural threat because reforms seem incompatible with Western expectations of modernization. They write that rather than China adapting to capitalism, capitalism is adapting to China. Yes, that's certainly true. But capitalism is not adapting to China because it operates on anything less or different than the logic of commodification, but because what makes the logic boundlessly adaptable is the absence of barriers that might otherwise be supplied by valuing sentience. Lynteris and Fernley unwittingly concede this when they point out that where markets do not contain, while markets do contain what many Western media portray as wild animals, the majority of these are actually bred and farmed in captivity: mallard ducks, frogs, and snakes. Only a smaller proportion of animals are actually poached from the wild for sale. Right? They argue that this is something that makes a morally relevant difference. They say that what matters, in other words, is not the form that the savagery takes, whether captured from the wild or bred in the misery of a factory farm. What concerns Lynteris and Fernley isn't in fact the animal, but rather our perception of what counts as food, and whether the conditions under which food is produced and distributed can become vectors for viral transmission. That they can safely assume Westerners will be relieved to know that most of these animals are bred in captivity. This only reinforces the commodification of sentience that undergirds the market, Chinese or otherwise, a point reinforced by their claim that the reason that wet markets should stay open is because the rule of capital by which they operate would merely reconstitute itself as a black market otherwise, less regulable, even more hazardous. They might be right about that. Well, it might be true that shutting down wet markets could lead to food shortages, the rise of black markets. The reasoning here remains, I think, circular. I think it's still ultimately self-defeating. It's precisely the absence of consideration for sentient life combined with the food insecurity of a human population whose growth is accelerated by the rise of industrial food production, itself driven by superpower economic aspirations that make the zoonotic transmission of deadly viruses ever more possible. As Emma Gonsalves reports for North Carolina University, quote, 6 out of every 10 infectious diseases in people are zoonotic. Other of these include SARS, H1N1, swine flu, and AIDS. Some of the worst diseases have emerged from the wildlife markets. The animals are sort of stacked on top of each other, she points out, usually still alive, breathing, defecating, good place for viruses to spread. We might be tempted to characterize Gonsalves' report as an example of Western prejudice and dismiss it as such. Maybe we would call such a report as imperialist or culturally insensitive. Maybe there's some truth in that. We can defend the right to food for Chinese workers and workers everywhere to be on solid moral footing as a right to eat. We can raise the banner of tradition and culture and of course find something of great value in doing so. But insofar as viruses like COVID are born of the zoonotic interface that results from habitat loss, that inevitably results from the ambitions of farmers regardless the scale of operation, insofar as these outbreaks are likely to be made more virulent and frequent by the climate crisis, whose toll on our own existential condition is becoming clearer by the day, insofar as this entire chaotic world system of the social, economic, environmental owes the suffering of its subjects, human and alike, to the radical of capitalist exchange, the commodification of sentience. It does not matter, I think, whether Gonsalves' reports is tinged with imperialism. It cannot matter. Where the existential stakes fail to outweigh culture and tradition, especially when they have themselves become fully capitalized, the consequence is self-defeat. This is not because culture and tradition lack intrinsic value, but because intrinsic is defeated by hunger, violence, disease, and death. Self-defeat, of course, can come in many forms: war, famine, starvation, migration, terrorism, disease. But the lesson, as Dawson might point out, is in the pangolin. Just as this species faces extinction, so might we. Appeal to culture and tradition will no more save us from the anthropogenic monsters we have created than the pangolin from the wet market, but that we persist in the view that our resources are endless and our existential condition immune to the possibility of extinction. This is not merely false as the death toll from COVID-19 or recurrent fire tornadoes or tsunamis or hurricanes, made all the more ferocious and frequent by the climate crisis. This is the arrogance that defines the kleptocene. What wet markets and factory farms have in common is a logic of commodification that takes sentience to pose no obstacle to exchange value. Having crossed that Rubicon, we have little incentive short of profit losses not to remain indifferent to savagery, whatever form it takes, whether bludgeoned to death with a metal pipe or crushed to death at the bottom of a cage stuffed with other animals, whether pigs or pangolins, chickens or peacocks, lambs or dogs. Non-human animals delimit the commodifiable and thereby make the conversion to exchange value of everything else possible. Naturalizing the cruelty required to carry out and ignore the bulldozing of sick cows, the grinding up of male chicks, the selling of pangolins for dinner, confers upon every other form of savagery the prospect of a price. That is the kleptocene. That will be our own extinction. Thank you. I hope you found this of value. Again, I'm very delighted to be able to share my work with you, and I would certainly love to hear back from you. That's Wendy Lynne Lee, W. Lee at bloomu.edu. All right, thanks again. I hope you have a lovely conference.